Ricardo had everything arranged so nothing would surprise him. The table was set with the kind of precision that reassured him. Linen pressed until it felt like a promise. Knives that caught the candlelight in a geometry he liked. A sommelier who moved in a way that suggested the world was still put together. The restaurant sat on a terrace aligned with the sea, and the city behind it wore its evening like a shawl of lights. He had eaten there before, always at the corner table where the view of the water turned a plate into a discovery. Tonight, the plate stayed mostly untouched. He watched his partner across the table with the same curiosity he had reserved for board meetings and product launches. The conversation was polite, the laughter measured, the names of investors traded like talismans. Ricardo's glass caught a sliver of moon, and it slid across his thoughts without stirring them. He had become practiced in the art of being full of appointments and empty of hunger. A child arrived without ceremony, as if she had always belonged to the cracks of the city. She was small enough to be mistaken for someone's errand and too steady to be only lost. Her hair was braided unevenly at the back, and she wore a jacket that had seen better winters. She moved with the kind of attention that comes from making room for danger. Fast, close to the walls, unseen until she took the edge of the tablecloth with a careful hand. "Sir?" Her voice was the sound of surprise folded into courage. "Can I sit? My belly is loud." Ricardo heard it like a note struck in a musician's silence. Not a demand, a small, clear admission. Those words, "my belly is loud," had a gravity to them, a truth stripped of explanation. The people at nearby tables glanced, then remembered their own dinners, and looked away. He stood before he could think better. In the heat of movement, his jacket brushed the back of his chair. The fabric made that gentlemanly sound his tailor preferred. The sommelier hesitated. The restaurant manager came forward with a smile tuned to diffuse incidents. "Excuse me, senor," the manager said, voice small with protocol. "This is a private table." "She can sit," Ricardo said. His voice surprised him, flat, as if used to giving commands. The manager blinked, unsure whether this was charity or eccentricity. The child's eyes widened, as if some pocket of air had been turned into unexpected ease. Sandra, who had been sitting at a discreet distance, Ricardo's housekeeper for years, a woman with the kind of competence that imagined every contingency, had come because Ricardo did not like to be alone in small social improvisations. She reached for a napkin and unfolded it like a map. "Bring her some soup," she instructed the waiter. Her tone allowed no argument. The soup arrived in a porcelain bowl with steam that smelled of roasted carrot and thyme. The child placed both hands on the rim and leaned forward, her ears attuned to the sound the spoon made. Ricardo watched her as one would study a photograph slowly developing. When she ate, she closed her eyes for a second, and a tiny, honest pleasure moved across her face. It struck him harder than any investor's compliment. "Thank you," she murmured between spoonfuls, and then, as if settling a debt of candor, "You look like a colonel." He almost laughed. The label was absurd. Ricardo had not worn a uniform since his grandfather's funeral and had never been in the army. But in the city there are names that stick like old signs. His grandfather had been a respected, remote man, often called the Coronel by neighbors. Wealth and posture had grafted that title onto Ricardo in social pages and gossip. The child's voice had not curled with reverence. She pronounced the word as if reading a map. It was funny, and then it was not. "And you are?" he asked, because he suddenly felt the strangeness of being seen in the way he had avoided being seen for years. "Julia," she said. "I sleep in the stairwell on Huamena, near the bakery that closes late." He wanted to ask how she knew where his table sat, why she wandered into a place where his world and hers should not intersect. Instead, he watched her small hands. They had the faint grit of the streets, a smudge by the nail of her right thumb. There was an economy to how she moved, how she counted coins, how she protected an imaginary pocket. Hunger had taught her to be precise. When they left the restaurant, the air was briny and sharp. Ricardo's driver, Antonio, waited with the car's doors hot from the sun that had been hidden and then given back by the pavement. Antonio's face said what everyone's face in the periphery said: surprise edged with an inventory of trouble. Being seen with a child like Julia could be a headline or a rumor, but Antonio had a practical mind. He saw complications, not image. "She's a street child," Antonio said in the car, the words nearly reverent. "She sat at my table," Ricardo said. Saying it made the evening into an event, one that broke along a seam he had not anticipated. He instructed Antonio to drive first to his apartment. The building in Ipanema had a double-key system and a marmorized lobby that reflected the sky. In his apartment, things were placed to be admired and not to be used. There was a couch he had never fallen asleep on, plates that matched in a way friends admired. Tonight, with a child in tow, the space felt like a stage where an improvisation would be revealed. Sandra took over as a kind of domestic triage. She fetched a towel and a bag of her own, small and practical. "We'll need to call social services," she said, which was both an operational plan and an offer of normalcy. Marcelo, the lawyer, would need to be alerted. There would be forms and a brief, efficient panic. Ricardo agreed to everything with the distance of someone signing a quasi-abstract contract. The investigation moved like a bureaucratic bird, efficient, without malice. Officials came to the apartment, to the restaurant, to the stairwell where Julia had slept. She pointed out things with a child's unembellished truth. "I like the light in his living room," she said once, tapping the lamp as if it were evidence. "It's warm." The social worker made notes, noting that the child had been exposed to stress and lacked stable guardianship, but that there was an adult willing to sign papers and provide food and a place to sleep. This was a ledger in which human kindness and legal procedure combined. The search for Julia's biological father was the procedural heart of the matter. Gilberto's name surfaced in the social worker's ledger as a person of interest living in Paraty, a small town on the coast south of the city. He had a history recorded in brief notes: missed child support, transient employment, a drinking problem that had been whispered about instead of confronted. There were no profound villains in the paperwork, only a pattern of absence. Ricardo had not wanted to be the type of man who moved quickly into other people's wounds. But the bond that had formed with Julia was a soft, unlabeled thing he did not want to expose to the slings of bureaucracy. He booked a train to Paraty on a gray morning, the sea visible in the distance like a held breath. Paolo, his brother, drove with maps folded into the passenger seat and a mixture of skepticism and something gentler in his face. Paolo had been estranged for years. Arguments about the family business, guilt made into distance. Yet he had come, and in his presence Ricardo felt something untidy and human. Paraty was the kind of town where the tide marked not only boats but reputations. Gilberto lived in a narrow house near the docks, the paints peeling in honest curls. He opened the door with a hand that seemed unpracticed in holding, like a man who had been surprised into parenthood and then left with the echo. He looked at Ricardo as if he had been expected and not expected at once. "Is she—" Gilberto began. His voice was hoarse, as if the sea had taken his breath sometimes. He had the look of someone who had learned to be ashamed without learning to correct. "I thought she was with the woman from the bakery," he said once. Ricardo told him what had happened, the restaurant, the soup, the drive back to the apartment, and did so with a care that kept tone and judgment separate. "We want what's best for Julia," he said. "We want to ensure she has safety. There will be a process." Gilberto's face changed when the word safety passed over it. For a moment he seemed to consider the possibility of being a father in the active sense, not speech alone, but presence. Then his eyes dropped, and he said plainly and without accusation, "I can't give her what she needs. I drink. When I'm sober, I am ashamed. When I drink, I am someone else." His admission was not theatrical. It was a weary kind of honesty, the sort that does not expect redemption at the finish line. He spoke of nights in which he was gone and mornings when he had disappeared like a bad season. He spoke of shame and not of excuses, and in that there was a human knot. There was a moment when the town's light softened, and Ricardo saw how close grief and relief are on the face of a man who confesses. The legal process required signatures, acknowledgments, time. Gilberto's renunciation was not immediate. There were calls home, tears that were personal and small, and then a slow signing of papers in a municipal office that smelled of coffee and bureaucracy. He would not contest custody, he said, but he would like to visit when appropriate. That humility was not triumph. It was the recognition of limits. Back in the city, life's scaffolding rearranged itself around a child. Mornings became a choreography. Wake up, oatmeal, brushing hair, the ritual of shoes that slid on with a sound that came to mean belonging. Ricardo found that small routines had the power to steady him. He learned to braid hair's unevenness into practical neatness. He learned the exact texture of Julia's favorite soup and how she preferred her bread warm from the toast. These were small things, but they were the scaffolding of family. Sandra taught Julia how to fold towels into rectangles and how a town has its own language of food. Antonio altered his routes so that she would no longer see the stairwell at night. Marcelo added legal updates to Ricardo's calendar in bold font: court dates, hearings, follow-up interviews. The city's social machinery had been engaged, and it carried with it a mixture of kindness and judgment. Public encounters were more delicate. At school enrollment, Other parents frowned with a polite suspicion, as if poverty could stick like mud and transfer by proximity. A neighbor complained about noise. A concierge raised eyebrows at unusual guests. Ricardo learned to carry these small slights like uncomfortable weather. Paulo, who returned to the apartment with bridges in his pockets, would sometimes stay and help with homework. And those evenings, books spread across the dining table, pencils marking lines, felt like a reclamation of old tenderness between brothers. There were nights when Julia woke and said, raw and small, "Mom went to heaven." She said it matter-of-factly, the way some children report a storm. Her mother had died, they learned, a fact that filled the room with a quiet that needed explaining. Ricardo did not have the words to make grief neat. He learned to say simply, "She's with the stars," or to sit with her and hold the space where words faltered. He found that you could be present and not always persuasive. Therapy came because the social worker recommended it, and because Ricardo, who had made a career out of managing variables, wanted to manage Julia's recovery. The therapist, a mulher named Renata, gritou-them com voz que de não traita a fixar tudo a tempo. She asked questions que foram blunts e compassivas. Where did you sleep last? O que deveria você temer? For Julia, questions foram como mapas. She pointed and gave answers. Sometimes he shrugged and changed the subject. There were nights quando she drew pictures do sea e nights quando she drew door e sete de chaves. E Renata as perguntou o que as chaves abriam. Julia drew a small figure inside the house e wrote, in child's hand, home. Ricardo's own therapy began more slowly. He had thought grief to be an archive he had closed, filed under loss and visited occasionally. In the therapist's small office, with its comfortable chair and wall of books, he found that grief was less a museum artifact and more a muscle that had atrophiated. He had never allowed someone to teach him how to be a father because he had been coached into making himself a provider rather than a guardian of tenderness. He had been millionaire and colonel, and those titles had been armor. In the quiet of therapy, he learned to take off the armor and sit with questions que foram blunt e intimate. Sometimes it hurt. He would return home and make soup. The pattern of normality was tentative. Julia missed the bakery's warmth and the neighborly kindness of a particular woman who sometimes gave her stale bread. She missed the familiarity of the stairwell in the way one misses a scar, odd comfort in a place that had once protected by virtue of being known. She showed signs of trust in a way that had the fragile logic of sprouts. The first night, she allowed Ricardo to kiss her forehead without pulling away. The first morning, she said, "Daddy," and he heard his name changed into something belonging to another future. Not everyone approved. At the restaurant where she had first asked to sit, old patrons speculated about motives. A columnist who called him the Millionaire colonel in a morning column hinted at grand gestures and publicity stunts. There were whispers about whether Ricardo had taken on Julia for a photo opportunity. It stung because the rumor made his private tenderness public before he could own it. He learned to swallow indignation so that his energy could be for the child. A legal hearing, scheduled as provisional custody, became a smaller stage for a larger truth. The court, sitting in a windowed room, had a sense of neutral dignity. The judge, someone with hair that was softer on the temples and eyes that watched the rhythm of people, listened. Marcelo presentó documentos. A social worker gave a brief testimonial about the child's circumstances and the father's renunciation in Paraty. Gilberto did not come to the hearing, but he sent a note indicating he understood the move. That absence was its own language. When the judge signed the provisional order, the paper felt like a map drawn through fog. It gave Ricardo authority, but not resolution. It was enough to keep Julia under his roof, to give them time. The room exhaled with the kind of relief that is both official and private. Those months knit small miracles into a routine. The sound of a spoon in a bowl, the shuffle of small feet across wood floors, the light in the living room when they read a story before bed. These were the quiet evidences of being rebuilt. Paula, the schoolteacher, praised Julia's intelligence and her capacity to learn quickly. She recommended a small desk and library books that made the child's eyes light up. Sandra took to waking early to bake bread, an offering that made the apartment smell like something close to home. Antonio found excuses to ferry them to the seaside on weekends, where salt and wind, the ancient healers, did their work. But healing is not a steady slope. There were setbacks. Julia had nights of nightmares where she would wake and whisper about shadows. She refused to sleep on some nights, insisting on the light. There were moments when she would mimic old defenses, sharp words, sudden withdrawal, that stung because they were not a reaction to present day's discomfort, but a reflex to older wounds. Ricardo learned to breathe through those times, to show up without trying to inscribe the moment with a lecture on love. And then came the date that all of them had been moving toward without saying it aloud. The final hearing, the one that would convert provisional custody into a permanent legal recognition. Marcelo had prepared meticulously. He arrived with binders and a small habit of repeating facts with a steady voice. He had worked in family law long enough to know how stories can be arranged into the form the court likes: evidence of stability, proof of capacity, documentation of consent. On the morning of the hearing, Julia put on a dress that surprised Ricardo with its hopeful color. Sandra had ironed it until the fabric lay as smooth as a promise. Ricardo found himself checking the small details: shoes tied, hair combed with patience. Inside him, a pressure rose like the tide, the hope that an official instrument could match the private truth they had built together. He felt suddenly fragile, as if a division that had existed for years might at last be rebalanced. Paulo came and sat with his hands folded, watching the city like someone who had been in exile and found a road back home. He squeezed Ricardo's hand once, a gesture that communicated both apology and a kind of blessing. "We'll be there," he said. It was the first time Paulo had used the plural pronoun in years. The courthouse was a building with the patient smell of paper and institutional coffee. People moved about in routines carved by duty. Inside the hearing room, the judge looked at the file and then at them. Ricardo sat with his back straight. Julia held his hand under the table, her fingers small and fierce. Marcelo spoke with a simplicity that had the force of truth. He summarized the months, the investigation, the social worker's findings, the father's renunciation, the child's need for permanence. The judge asked direct questions about stability and plans. Ricardo answered not with legalese, but with plainness. "I want her to have a home," he said. "I want her to have a life where she does not wonder where her next meal will come from. I've changed my life to make space for that." There was a moment when Ricardo felt the weight of his past, losses that had made him cautious, and he recognized how much of his life had been built to avoid the risk of attachment. Love had been monetized into care, affection had been measured in actions that did not require vulnerability. In court, vulnerability had a name: responsibility. He accepted it with a steadiness he had not known he had. The judge's pen made a small sound when it signed. The legal clause transformed into a human thing. Julia's name would be on the papers as his child. The room, which had been a place of protocol, turned into a stage of private relief. Julia smiled, a quick, radiant thing, like a lamp being switched on. Afterward, there was a small ritual. Sandra bought a cake, and they returned to the apartment where the light in the living room seemed to know how to make sinuous patterns across the floor. They called Gilberto, who spoke haltingly, and said he would come to visit when he could be sober and solid. He asked whether it was all right if he learned how to be present gradually. Ricardo said yes, because that was what he believed. People could be armatures for better selves if given space. At night, when the city put its lights back on, Ricardo sat on the balcony and watched the water. He thought of the way a title had once filled space inside him and now felt like an empty collar. Being called Colonel had been a public script. Being called Daddy had changed the inner grammar of his life. It was a small miracle, and he knew miracles were often the accumulation of small, steadfast acts rather than thunderbolts. Months later, they traveled to Paraty together. Julia had never been more excited to see the sea that had framed her father's life. Gilberto met them at the docks with a sober smile. He brought with him a kindness woven with guilt. He brought, too, a small, careful attempt at repair that began with a conversation and proceeded slowly toward regular visits. They spoke of boundaries and of what a father could be when he knew his limits. There were no triumphs, only attempts, which, for these people, was enough. The home continued to gather rituals. In the kitchen, they learned to make pain de queijo together. Julia grinned when cheese strings stretched past her lips. On Sundays, Ricardo would walk with the child to a market and watch her pick fruit as if choosing colors for a painting. He learned to ask questions that were not interrogations, but invitations. "What made you laugh today?" And to listen. There were nights when old griefs returned like visitors, patient and unannounced. Ricardo would sometimes find himself standing in the doorway of the room he shared with Julia, watching her breathe. He thought of his own childhood and the absence that had shaped him into someone who built walls. He realized that walls could be unlearned, but only by making small choices every day, letting someone sleep with a nightlight because they were afraid of the dark, or leaving a desk appointment to attend a school play. The process of becoming a family was a collage of these acts. It was not always tidy. There were disagreements, moments of sharpness, times when Julia's fear made her lash out and when his patience ran thin. But the thread that connected them was relentless, an intention to stay. When the final hearing, official adoption, was scheduled, was not an act of triumph, but a formal recognition of what had quietly become true. The courtroom smelled like paper and coffee once again, but this time the papers were less like instruments and more like a seal. Marcelo had organized everything. He had become a fixture in their lives. Public curiosity had not withered, but it had softened. The columnist who had once suggested publicity stunts now wrote a different piece about the strange, necessary kindness of the city. On the day the judge pronounced the adoption final, Ricardo looked at Julia and felt the shape of his life change in a way that words could not hold. The judge asked if anyone present wished to speak. Julia stood up, small and precise. She folded her hands and looked at the judge with an earnestness that seemed to compress all the months into a single shining sentence. "Thank you," she said, "for food, for sleeves that cover me, for a bed, for Daddy." The word landed like a single bell in the courtroom. It carried the weight of long months and small mornings. Ricardo's throat tightened. He felt something open inside with the sound of being named. He had always been Ricardo Almeida, son of a businessman and grandson of a coronel. Now he was something else, father. After the formalities, there was a quiet moment in the corridor where they stood with sandwiches bought from a kiosk. Paulo slipped an arm around Ricardo and squeezed, a small affirmation. Sandra dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief and laughed softly. Both tears and joy pressed into the same breath. Antonio tipped his hat slightly and said, as if stating a fact that had always been true, "You're a good man for her." Gilberto had come to the hearing. He stood a respectful distance away and did not intrude. His presence was a reminder that the past was not erased. He spoke once to Ricardo, quietly. "Thank you," he said. "I couldn't do it. I'm sorry." Ricardo accepted the apology with a steadiness that humbled him. Ele entendeu que furgiviços vos não era uma absolução de todas as coisas, mas reconhecimento de uma pessoa atento a retornar. She está safe por causa de pessoas que founded her, Ricardo said, because of help and honesty. That night, they had a small celebration at home. It was modest, candles on a simple cake, laughter that came in little bursts. Julia fell asleep with her head on Ricardo's shoulder, a small weight that told him in the way children tell adults things without words. "I will rest here. I will be watched." Some months later, as the light in the living room poured in the afternoon and painted the floor the color of warm bread, Julia opened a small box and took out a key. Inside, she had placed a tiny charm, a shell she had found in Paraty. She handed the key to Ricardo with the solemnity of a small ritual. "This key is for the door to my room," she said. "So you remember I belong." Ricardo took the key and put it on his ring where other keys lived, office, car, safe. It looked ordinary among metal and brass, but in that ordinary metal there was a new weight, a promise of belonging. He felt the bright, tender light of something that could be named hope. Months dissolved into a rhythm that held more softness than he had imagined possible. There were days when he still felt hollow in a way that money had once filled, but the hollowness was not a chasm now. It was a place into which tenderness could grow. He learned to measure success not by quarterly reports, but by the sound of laughter at breakfast. He canceled a meeting to go to a school recital and found the decision costless in the currency of his soul. The city, which had always been both spectacular and indifferent, watched as their small family stitched itself into the fabric of ordinary life. At night, from the balcony where the lights of the bay flickered, Ricardo sometimes whispered to no one and to himself that he had once thought a colonel's title would be the thing that marked him as complete. He had been wrong. The title had been a veneer. What made him whole was the daily, untheatrical work of being present. On a quiet Sunday, they walked down to the water. The sea had become a reoccurring symbol in Julia's drawings, a place where things were washed and returned. They stood together at the edge, feeling the salt and the wind. Julia closed her eyes and laughed as a wave wet her shoes. Ricardo watched her and felt a kind of fearless tenderness he had once thought reserved for other people's stories. When she slipped her small hand into his, it was a simple, irrevocable gesture. "Daddy," she said, the word soft and full. Ricardo had once been called the millionaire colonel in glossy columns and whispered anecdotes. Now, when she said "Daddy," the city's labels dissolved into an ordinary, necessary truth. He would carry that title, this title, through meetings and dinners, through the small shocks of life and the long afternoons of contentment. Outside, the sea kept moving, relentless and indifferent and beautiful. Inside, they had learned to feed one another, the habit of bringing nourishment to the table, first in bowls and later in words. They had learned to let light fall where it needed to unlock doors that had been closed, to let someone else in. At night, on the balcony, Ricardo sometimes felt that the miracle of it was not the drama of a rescue, but the relentlessness of small acts. Julia's hunger had been a compass that pointed him toward a life he had not imagined wanting. The legal papers were necessary, the court signatures important, but the truth was in the oatmeal bowls, the folded towels, and the way a small hand slipped into a larger one without checking for anything else. The past remained, a patchwork of losses that had shaped who he had been, but it was not the future. The future belonged to the quiet labor of staying. If the city ever wrote about him again, they might call him the millionaire colonel with old amusement. He did not mind collars and labels. What mattered was that in a small, luminous way he had learned to be loved, and to love back in practical, stubborn gestures. They lived onward, not perfectly, but with intention. Sometimes the neighbor brought over a pie and asked about the child, and sometimes the columnist wrote a new piece about second chances. Gilberto stopped by on Sundays sometimes, bearing small offerings and the complicated gratitude of a man learning to be present. Paulo and Ricardo rebuilt a brotherhood that sat without pretense. Marcelo remained in their lives as a steady professional presence. Sandra kept the house from sliding back into anonymity and cooked with a talent that made the apartment smell like permanence. Years later, when Julia would tell the story, if she told it at all, she would say there was a night when soup tasted like hope, and a man named Connell who had money and a heart they both learned to grow into. The city would keep its indifferent rhythm, and somewhere someone would have a hungry child and a heart poised for an interruption. Ricardo stood on the balcony one evening, the sea's distant lights like a scatter of small fireflies, and held the small charm she had given him. He put the key on the ring and listened to the faint, steady breathing from the room inside. He had once measured himself by the numbers in his accounts. Now he measured himself by the number of times he had said with genuine voice, "I'm here." The word folded the day into something close to sacred. The millionaire Connell had been given a new name that fit in the mouth of a girl. Daddy. He had been broken open by a child's hunger and mended by the work of being present. The city watched, and sometimes the watching was kind. If anything about the story could break your heart, it would be the old emptiness he carried before that first night, an emptiness that many people carry, and how easily it could have remained unaltered. But what mended him was not a headline, but a small hand that asked to sit, and a bowl of soup that made him see himself in the eyes of someone who needed him. It was an everyday redemption, slow and stubborn, and it asked nothing of anyone but the courage to be available. This was how redemption usually arrived, unannounced, in a discarded napkin, in a child's plain request, even when the world around them would have preferred the story to be simpler, or neater, or less messy. They had found each other in the middle of that mess, and in finding, they had reconfigured a life. If you ever find yourself walking by the bay and see a small figure tugging at the sleeve of a tall man, know that you are looking at a private miracle, ordinary, persistent, and quietly whole. He folded the key into the palm of his hand until it warmed with his skin, then went inside. The apartment smelled faintly of lemon and cinnamon, Sandra's way of making ordinary afternoons feel ceremonial. Julia lay under her blanket like a small, peaceful promise. Her hair had escaped its braid and lay across the pillow in a dark comet tail. He watched her for a long time, counting the small hesitations in her breath, learning anew how many different silences a person could make. Days stacked like that, ordinary liturgies of presence. There were school runs and visits to the pediatrician, and evenings when Ricardo taught her to tie a knot in a length of rope and pretended they were sailors crossing the Sound. There were also meetings, of course, numbers that still required his attention, obligations that could not be ignored, and he learned to carry them differently, like a man carrying a child on his shoulders through a market, attentive both to the child's laughter and to the cry of the merchants below. The ledger did not vanish, but it softened at the corners. Once, walking home from the market with a bag of oranges and Julia's small hand tight in his, a taxi skidded in front of them, and the driver's face went white with an alarm he could not disguise. For a moment, Ricardo felt that old private emptiness like a draft. He tightened his grip on her hand without noticing, and watched the way she did not panic, only blinked and said, as if naming a bird she had seen before, "Daddy, the driver is upset." It was a small, steadying thing, to be needed for the being of someone else. It rearranged priorities like a map unfolded. Once, walking home from the market with a bag of oranges and Julia's small hand tight in his, a taxi skidded in front of them, and the driver's face went white with an alarm he could not disguise. For a moment, Ricardo felt that old private emptiness like a draft. He tightened his grip on her hand without noticing, and watched the way she did not panic, only blinked and said, as if naming a bird she had seen before, "Daddy, the driver is upset." It was a small, steadying thing, to be needed for the being of someone else. It rearranged priorities like a map unfolded. Where were questions that arrived with her growth? At 5, she asked why the moon sometimes hid her face. At 6, she wanted to know why carrots tasted better when eaten from the pot without the plate. At 7, sitting at the kitchen table with a spoon of yogurt wobbling in front of her, she said, blunt and bright, "Where is my mother?" Ricardo had rehearsed an answer for this possible day. Not a script, but a set of honest options he would shape around her age. He reached for one of them then, the one that spoke of love without shame. He set his own spoon down, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked at her as if deciphering a small constellation. "There are many kinds of mothers," he said. "Some sit in the same house as the child. Some live far away. Some are not able to take care of a little one, and someone else steps in. I am your father now, Julia. I take care of you. You are mine." She considered this as children do, with an economy of thought. Was she sad? She asked. He felt the old emptiness stir, his imagination wanting to fill in a face, an explanation, a villain or a saint. He resisted painting wildly. Maybe she was, he said. Maybe she had things she couldn't change. But sadness does not tell the whole story. People have trouble, and we don't always know it. What matters is that you are here, and someone chose to stay. She nodded, as if the choice was a thing that could be pointed to on the table and examined. Then she resumed her yogurt. That night, after he tucked her in and felt her small hand curl around his finger, Ricardo went to the living room where Gilberto sat with a book he had not yet opened. Gilberto's visits had become a sort of domestic sacrament. He arrived with food, sometimes with a record, often with the kind of silences that felt like prayers. "You handled that well," Gilberto said, not looking up. "Do you think she'll—" Ricardo began, then stopped. The sentence was an invitation to complexities he did not yet want to name. "Children carry stories forward in their way," Gilberto said. "You do not have to carry them alone." There were other sweet, awkward rituals. Paulo, who had once been as much in Ricardo's life as an old ledger, learned to make pancakes that were deliberately lopsided, but the right color. He took to reading comics at the breakfast table and taught Julia facts about the city's buses that she would repeat as though they were important secrets. Marcelo, precise as ever, kept a file of documents neatly labeled with an almost tender attention to detail. Occasionally, he would slide one across the table and lower his voice as if offering a private counsel. Sandra, whose hand seemed to know where comfort hid in an apartment, wove cinnamon and order into their days, and sometimes on a Sunday pressed a small paper crown into Julia's palm and announced that she was the queen of something that made no sense to anyone but a child. The city, which could be indifferent, sometimes surprised them with a kind of attention. A neighbor who had once scoffed at the Millionaire colonel's headlines left a casserole on their steps. A woman in the building's lobby who sold flowers from a cart learned to save 1 or 2 stems for Julia's desk at school. The world, in small increments, made room. Public eyes never entirely slunk away. The columnist who relished second chances would occasionally write a line, and the paper would arrive at Ricardo's door as if to measure how open his life had become. He called Gilberto e Marcelo e Paulo em quick sucessão. not to spill intimacies, but to gather counsel, a chorus of friends who had become a domestic tribunal de affection. "We will find a way," Marcelo said, pragmatic as ever. "We ask questions. We meet somewhere neutral. We do not blind her with the past." Gilberto was quieter. "The heart chooses what it can carry," he said. "We will carry it with care." Ricardo arranjou to meet Rosa in a small café on the edge of the neighborhood, a place Sandra liked for its light and the way the steam rose from the cups like a benediction. He told Julia they were going to visit a lady who wanted to see a picture. He found himself explaining things he had not yet fully understood, what it meant to belong to someone by choice, what it meant to be chosen. Rosa was younger than he had expected. She had the thin-lined face of a woman who had carried hard years. When Ricardo arrived, she was already there, hands folded over a purse, watching the door as if someone might burst in any second and change the terms of their meeting. She looked at him like someone measuring how much trust it took to step out of the past. They began with small talk, careful as people repairing a bridge plank by plank. Rosa's voice trembled occasionally, but she did not ask for anything sensational. She spoke of nights when the world had seemed too loud, of mistakes and a stubbornness that could fracture lives. She told him with an unadorned honesty that she had thought of Julia every day. "And when I found out she had a father who—" She stopped. "You did not find out because of me," Ricardo said softly. "You found out because of the system, perhaps. You found out because the world does not want things it cannot tidy. But we can decide now how to move forward." Rosa lowered her eyes to the cup in front of her. "I want to see her," she said simply. The simplicity of that wantedness disarmed him. He had imagined all kinds of confrontations, accusations, demands, legal battles. Instead, there was a human in front of him who wanted what many people want and few are given the chance to ask for: presence, to be part of a life she had once stepped away from. They did not make any promises in that café, but they made intentions. Rosa agreed to undergo an evaluation with a social worker, not to prove herself, but to prepare a way to meet Julia that would not upend the small domestic stability they had constructed. Ricardo agreed to bring Rosa a photograph of Julia, to let the child know that there were adults who cared for both truth and tenderness. When he told Julia, he did so as gently as possible, choosing language that did not force an adult's grief or need onto a small mind. "There is someone who would like to know you," he said. "A woman who loved you before I did. Would you like to see her photograph?" Julia thought for a moment, then nodded. She peered at the photograph with the air of a young judge considering two claims of affection. "She looks like a sister," she observed. Ricardo laughed, a short, relieved sound, and felt a sudden lightness. The future, which had once been a blank to be filled with numbers or empty ledger lines, was now a horizon where other people could come and go according to the rules they would carefully agree upon. The encounter with Rosa did not make the past harmless. It merely opened a doorway whose threshold they would cross together or not, slowly. Life kept its ordinary insistence while these quieter tectonic shifts occurred. Seasons changed colors on the trees, and Julia learned to ride a bicycle down the slope near the bay. Her knees skinned occasionally, and her joy loud enough to make a man in the park take off his hat and smile. Ricardo learned to be patient with his own lapses. Sometimes he would find himself counting the days since the first night and wonder at the man who had been there before. He still had nights when loneliness crept in, but those nights were different, less of an inevitability and more a call to do the small, unflashy work of connection. There were also practical decisions, schools to consider, financial choices that were no longer only about profit, but about how resources could create stability without turning into a cage. He thought of creating a small scholarship in Julia's name, a way to invest in other children's steady meals without turning charity into spectacle. He spoke with Marcelo about it. They drew up plans, quietly, deliberately, with the kind of care that treated generosity like a craft. The initiative was modest and local, meant to feed more suppers than headlines, and it made him feel as if his money could be translated into dignity. Then, on a morning when the city's light poured like a promise through the curtains and Julia was late for school because she had insisted on taking slow steps to count all the pigeons on their stoop, Ricardo opened the mail and found a thin envelope addressed in a hand that slanted as if the writer had lived through gusts. Inside was a photograph, a yellowed snapshot of a small girl with the same dark hair, asleep in a garden, and on the back, in faded ink, a single line, "For when she learns to ask." He sat down at the kitchen table with the photo in his hand and felt the accumulated weight of choices, his and others, settle around him like a soft, necessary cloak. There was fear ahead, certainly, the fear of public spectacle, of reopening old wounds, of making a child's life into something negotiated in headlines and lawyers' offices. There was also, tangentially and as surely, the possibility of an expanded family. Imperfect, cautious, real. He put the photo into a small box with other small things, the first spooned oatmeal bowl, the chipped cup from the market, a folded ticket to a concert they had never attended. He closed the box and placed it on the top shelf where he could not see it every day, but knew where it rested when he needed to summon courage. That afternoon they walked to the bay. The light there was thin and merciful. Julia ran ahead and then ran back, announcing each crab she found with the solemnity of a herald. Ricardo watched her and realized how much of his life had become a sequence of tiny, steadfast acts, showing up, answering questions, choosing presence. He had been given a title that had nothing to do with his former ledger. He was not only a father, but a keeper of ordinary miracles. When they reached the water's edge, a woman stopped them to tell a short story about a child she had once known, who had been given a second name by a neighbor, and who had learned to weave garlands out of paper. The anecdote was small, and perhaps true, and perhaps not. The city was full of such short testimonies. Ricardo listened politely and then let the woman go. He looked down at Julia, who had found a small shard of blue glass and was holding it up to the light as if it were a jewel. "You see what light does?" he said. "It makes small things into treasures." She smiled. "You did that, Daddy." He did not correct her. He let the compliment sit like a warm stone in his chest. The city, indifferent and beautiful, went on with its traffic and its gossip. He would have to make choices about Rosa in the days ahead, about how to involve Julia, about how much to invite the past in, and how much to protect the ordinary sanctuaries they had built. But for the moment, the miracle was present and small and real. A child with dirt under her nails, a man who had learned to measure himself by the count of his presence, and a bay that kept its patient turning. They walked home with the tide murmuring and the city lights beginning to puncture dusk. At the door, a note had been slipped beneath their mat, an unsigned encouragement from a neighbor who had once been skeptical. It said simply, "Keep doing what you are doing." Ricardo held that scrap of paper for a long time. He folded it into his wallet as if it were an amulet, and climbed the stairs into the place that smelled of dinner and the ordinary work of keeping a life intact. He was aware, now more than ever, that the most important battles were often fought in small kitchens with small spoons and the steady, stubborn refusal to let loneliness have the final word. Outside, the sea kept moving. Inside, they learned again how to feed one another. There would be meetings to negotiate, a social worker to meet, questions that would require more courage than he had yet summoned. But the rhythm of their days had become a kind of script, uneventful, profoundly sacramental. Breakfast, walking to school, a phone call that could change everything, a conversation held with care, the long, steady work of keeping a child safe enough to become herself. When they reached the water's edge, a note had been slipped beneath their mat, an unsigned encouragement from a neighbor who had once been skeptical. It said simply, "Keep doing what you are doing." Ricardo held that scrap of paper for a long time. He folded it into his wallet as if it were an amulet, and climbed the stairs into the place that smelled of dinner and the ordinary work of keeping a life intact. Outside, the sea kept moving. Inside, they learned again how to feed one another. There would be meetings to negotiate, a social worker to meet, questions that would require more courage than he had yet summoned. But the rhythm of their days had become a kind of script, uneventful, profoundly sacramental. Breakfast, walking to school, a phone call that could change everything, a conversation held with care, the long, steady work of keeping a child safe enough to become herself. On the balcony later that night, with Julia tucked in bed and the city's lights splayed like small constellations, Ricardo held the photograph he had received that morning. He let the paper be thin and fragile between his fingers and thought of Rosa as a complicated human who had made a choice that changed many lives. The future, he understood, would ask for both firmness and softness. It would demand that he steward both his money and his heart in ways that did not contradict one another. He put the photograph back into its thin envelope, and then, with a decision both humble and resolute, set it in the box with the other small things. He closed the lid and walked away, feeling that the work ahead was not a journey into spectacle, but an extension of the quiet craft he had already learned. To be present, to protect, to let love be practical without being performative. The city hummed below, and somewhere a child laughed at a joke only she could understand. Ricardo listened and, for the first time in a long string of days, felt the future as an open room, full of furniture yet to be moved in, full of small tasks and unexpected guests, and, if he chose rightly, full of room enough for a past and a present to sit across from each other at a table and take tea. He breathed in the night air and let himself be grateful for the ordinary difficulty of such a life. Then his phone buzzed, a number he did not expect, and he answered it, because the shape of his life had come to mean that most things should be faced, not avoided. He listened. A voice on the line spoke in the measured way of someone who had been thinking carefully. It was the social worker who would help arrange the next steps for Rosa. Questions of timing, of safety, of how Julia might be introduced to the idea of a mother who had been absent. Ricardo said yes to the first meeting. He said that they would do it slowly. He said that they would remember the child first. He said, finally, "We will be careful." The social worker thanked him and promised to send dates. He hung up and looked at the city, then at the small lighted window where his daughter slept. He felt both fear and a warmth that had nothing to do with headlines. He had been given a new title, Daddy, and also a new test of stewardship. He did not yet know everything. He only knew how to be there. He closed the balcony door and went to the small box on the shelf, running his thumb over the worn edge of the photograph's envelope. In the days to come, they would have to make choices that balanced truth and tenderness, that let a child keep her safety while welcoming the possibility of a past reclaiming a place. For now, the night held its soft ordinariness, and he sat with it like a man who had learned to appreciate the slow miracles, those small, tenacious acts of care that, in the end, made a life. Then there would be conversations, and forms, and the slow, sometimes clumsy measures of creating a family. There would also be the afternoons when Julia invented songs, and the mornings when she would still reach for his hand before crossing a street. Each small act would be part of the larger work, the relentless practice of staying. He understood, with a clarity he had not always possessed, that redemption was never a single dramatic moment. It was a long list of decisions repeated until habit and love braided together into something steady. He turned off the lamp and walked down the hallway to the bedroom, where the small rise and fall of a child's breathing mapped the room in soft arcs. He touched her hair and whispered, for his own ears as much as hers, "I'm here." The words folded the night, as they always had now, into something like grace. Later, when the social worker's first email arrived and Rosa's name appeared again on a checklist of steps to be taken, Ricardo read it slowly and then saved it in a folder labeled with a word that had once meant little to him: home. He closed his laptop and let himself rest, knowing that the coming days would require more patience and courage, but feeling certain, finally, that he knew how to keep choosing. Outside, the bay breathed its slow, indifferent beauty. Inside, a family learned in the hard, exquisite way to expand without breaking. The city watched, and sometimes, when it chose to, it was kind.